Hey everyone, Mike here. I'm going to be talking about what is the best white paint. Is there a best white paint? What is there to talk about when it comes to white paint? I'm going to be covering all that today, and here are the timestamps for all the specific topics. I'm going to split today's video into two parts. First, there's the background knowledge for white paints. This is going to be super helpful for DIYers or for professional painters. I'll give you some knowledge that's going to help empower you to make educated purchasing decisions, as well as techniques for application. Then I'll cover some more aesthetic components, which will touch on some of the background knowledge that I went over in the first part of the video. But if you're thinking about hiring someone to do the painting and you really don't care about all the technical components that go into white paints and how to apply them, then just skip on over to the second part of the video that covers aesthetics and durability. Is white paint just paint without colorant? Is it just white paint without added colors? Well, yes and no. There are two types of bases that you mix pigments in to create paint. They're clear bases and white bases. The white bases are used for mixing lighter colored paints, whereas the clear bases are used for mixing darker or richer colored paints. Most manufacturers have 3 to 4 different types of base paints. Each manufacturer may have their own name for the base paints, but they usually go something like this: white, medium, dark, neutral. Some manufacturers, like Sherwin-Williams for example, even have specialty base paints, like red or yellow. And these are used to create colors that would otherwise not be possible. You can buy base paint and mix the tints in yourself, but unless you know what you're doing, this is kind of risky. You'll likely end up spending a bunch of time and resources and flushing them down the drain. It's not really as simple as just adding tints. Good paints also use additives which help the tints bind properly to the base paint, producing a nice looking color. Reputable paint companies have spent decades, if not centuries, working on their recipes, and it'd be a little bit unrealistic to think that you could just spend a couple weekends mixing and matching paint pigments in your basement and whip up something better than Behr or PPG. But if you do have decent background in that, that's an option for you. Something that people often ask is, well, can I just use a white base paint instead of actually buying white paint? You could technically do that. If you really love the way that paint looks, then go for it. Just be aware that coverage is going to be very low with this base paint, because there are no pigments added to it. That means that you'll likely have to put on more than 2 coats to get the standard full coverage. High hide and beefed up paints. You can ask a store for beefed up or high hide paint. That means that they're simply going to add a lot of extra pigments or tint to that paint so that it helps provide better coverage. Some manufacturers will already have a pre-mixed paint like this. For instance, PPG's High Hide. High Hide is PPG's #1 selling product, and it's super popular amongst DIY painters. Reason being is that it has really high coverage. It provides a durable coat, covers what's underneath, and allows for easy and clean looking touch-up work. Beefed up paint is just paint with extra pigment. Going with the base paint is not going to cover well because it lacks pigments. While on the other hand, a beefed up paint is a paint with a lot of pigments. As a result, it covers really well in less coats. Why is white one of the hardest colors to cover? White can be a really hard color to cover. Yep, doesn't really sound like it makes sense when you first think about it. Like I talked about earlier, base paint for lighter colors is white and clear for darker colors. That white base paint contains a larger percentage of calcium carbonate and titanium dioxide, which are both responsible for adding the opaque element to the paint, which means it's less transparent. So when we look at a color like dark red and we think, oh, that's great, that's going to cover way better than a color like white, but this isn't always the case. The tints or pigments that are added to the paint are actually a big contributor to how well that paint covers in just 2 coats. That's why sometimes you'll find white paints without much pigment that don't cover well, similar to how dark paints without much white base paint don't cover very well. The paints that have the best coverage are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum that have both of these qualities. What's the best white paint for good coverage? That definitely has a lot to do with personal preference. One of the most popular white paints is Benjamin Moore's Chantilly Lace. It's a great one because it has natural undertones which help make it cover very well. Another really popular one is Sherwin-Williams Extra White. That uses some cooler undertones and as a result has slightly less coverage. What's the best white paint if you're a landlord and want to repaint inside a rental unit? If you strictly want a white paint that will cover well, check with the manufacturer or store and ask them if they can add pigment to their white-based paint to make it a high-hide or beefed-up white. Some manufacturers will have pre-mixed white paints ready to go that's designed specifically to cover better and will also cover better than just using white bases with no pigment added. Cabinets. Again, color is really just a preference when it comes to your cabinets. The one thing that you really will want to consider is how much natural light do you get in your kitchen. A lot of interior designers would say that a flat or matte finish would complement your cabinets very well and help to bring out a natural hue. On the other hand, if you're not getting much light in your kitchen, a higher sheen paint might be better. That really helps to brighten up an area that's heavily reliant on artificial light. If you're painting for a homeowner and they want white trim or a white ceiling, what's the best white that you should use or recommend? If you own a painting company and your client isn't really that particular about what kind of white paint they get, even after you've explained all the subtle differences between hues and tones and sheens, and they really don't care, then just go for the best bang for your buck. So take into consideration the price of the paint, coverage, and ease of application. Go with something that has some natural undertones so that you get good coverage, and also go with the low sheen because that'll make application way easier. Like I mentioned before, High Hide by PPG is a great paint. It checks all the boxes that I'm talking about, and you can't go wrong with it. Can you just use white primer instead of white paint? No. Primer is not the same as white paint. Primer is used to help bond paint to a surface that it would not normally bond well to. The primer acts as a middleman, bonding well to the surface and as well to the paint, providing a more durable, long-lasting finish. Well, what if you really love the way your primer looks and you just want to leave it that way? Don't leave your primer unfinished. Primer isn't produced to withstand the test of time like paint is. It's not a finished material. If you leave it on a wall without putting finish over it, it's eventually going to break down into kind of a chalky material. And it does a really poor job at protecting surfaces. For example, if you were to get dust on a painted wall, you could take a damp rag to it and wipe it off. If you did that on a primed wall, you'd just mash the dust into the wall and slowly make it worse and worse. Also, primer doesn't protect your walls from odors the same way paint does. So if you do a lot of cooking or you got a stinky dog, then those scents are likely going to linger a lot longer than they would if you painted the walls. Or worse, that could just simply become the way your home smells. Trust me, just use finish. The general rule of thumb is you want to get finish on primed walls within 30 days. Alright, let's move on to the aesthetics and durability component of white paints. How many different white paints are there? Well, to be honest, I had to look that one up. Some people say 900, other people say over 150,000. It's a pretty wide range. The potential for white shades is limitless. It's the sort of thing you could get a little ridiculous over and say, well, technically these paints might look the same to the naked eye, but they are actually different because they use a different percentage of this pigment versus that pigment. Benjamin Moore, for example, has over 150 shades of white. Fact of the matter is there are enough shades of white that you should be able to find what you're looking for. How to pick your special white paint. If you were to ask a bunch of interior designers how they would pick a white paint, you'd get two main answers. You can pick whites with warm hues or cool hues. Warm hues include natural undertones like brown, orange, or gold. Cool hues contain undertones like gray or blue. The first tactic would be to match hues in the paints with the ambiance of your home. So if you have a more rustic looking home, then go with some natural undertones. Go with a off-white that's more beige rather than gray or blue. It would help to create a sense of flow in your living space, if that makes sense. The other point of view would say, go ahead and create some contrast. If you live in a modern looking home, then go ahead and throw some natural hues in there. Or if you live in a rustic home, then go ahead and toss some cool undertones in there to create a stark contrast. I know some people will probably have an issue with what I'm saying here, but ultimately it really only matters to you. How do you want your home to look? It's your home, so go with that choice. And as I would recommend with any color of paint, go get some samples and try them on in your home. This is especially important with white paints because the undertones are so evident. It'll be really important to come back and check on these paints at different times of day, or if you have enough time, with different weather conditions. So your white paints might look really different on a sunny day compared to a cloudy day. And if you live somewhere where it's constantly cloudy, then maybe you should cater your paints more towards that kind of weather than sunny. Why does white paint last longer than colorful paint? Or does it? One of the most common questions we get is, why do white paints last longer on the outside of homes than dark paints? Whites and off-whites last longer than colored paints for a few reasons. First of all, they use inorganic compounds which take longer to break down than the organic compounds used in more colorful paints. These pigments break down when they're continually exposed to UV radiation. So desert climates, or even worse, high desert climates with a high UV index will take a high toll on your paint. Another reason that the white paints last longer is because they reflect a lot more light than the darker colors. That means that the darker colors absorb more light than the lighter ones, and as a result, they heat up more. Well, what does that mean in practical terms? As the paint heats up, it puts more stress on the pigments. So naturally, over time, the darker paints are constantly exposed to higher temperatures, which causes the pigments to break down faster. And last but not least, like I talked about earlier, the lighter paints use that white base, and the white base contains high amounts of titanium dioxide, which is one of the active ingredients in sunscreen and goes a long ways towards increasing longevity of these lighter colored paints. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. If you liked today's video, please go ahead and drop a like, sub, or comment. See you in the next one.